power and force does work.
Huh? You telling jokes?
No, I was trying to get my coffee and I was using the power of the force and we all four crashed it.
Fortune's mine, though. All right. So, many of you know that my lovely bride, Teresa, has been the youth pastor at Anacortes Christian Church now for the last 10 years. Before that, she was a volunteer for another 7 or 8, so she has been involved with the youth in Anacortes for the last close to 20 years. Now, many of you also know that last Saturday that she said that she had resigned her position there. And it's a bittersweet thing. Now, most of the congregation down there know that she has been an absolutely fantastic involved youth pastor. All right? But she's also been in the preaching rotation there, which quite frankly, in a more traditional church than this, is pretty spectacular. And there were people who were very much against a woman at the pulpit. But my wife converted just about all of them. Even if they wouldn't admit that it was okay to have a woman there, they all said, man, what you say really touches me. So, I've always been amazed at the way my wife sits and listens to God. And then carefully and painstakingly writes down what she hears from him. This being in contrast, of course, to my simply hoping that I'm really saying what he wants as I stand up here and sort of throw it out there to you sometimes. So today, I want to share with you a small piece of what Anacortes Christian Church has had the pleasure of experiencing for the last several years. So the following was given to Teresa, and I'm going to read it to you. Today, we are going to look at two men who, though their stories are different, share a brokenness brought upon them by their actions and their selfishness. However, because of their willingness to cry out to the Lord in their brokenness, we read about them in Hebrews chapter 11, the chapter of the faithful. It says, "And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouth of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies." The first we're going to talk about is Samson, the 12th judge of the Israelites. What would you have said if your parents had told you they had made an agreement with God, an agreement that you were supposed to uphold for your entire life? It wasn't a big deal. You just couldn't cut your hair or touch anything unclean, which in those days meant diseased or dead. Oh, and you couldn't eat or drink anything from the vine. Grapes, grape juice, wine, that kind of thing. I don't think I'd have had a problem with the unclean or dead stuff. That's not something I'm in the habit of touching anyway. But I kind of like grape juice, really like grapes. And as far as my hair goes, well, I do like to keep up with fashions. But this is how Samson grew up. He was a Nazarite, set apart for God from birth. Not only all this, but he was an Israelite. And it was assumed that when he married, it would be to an Israelite girl. Well, according to the story, Samson wants none of these rules, except maybe for the hair. It's probably a big hit with the ladies with those luxurious locks of his. Anyway, he travels to a Philistine town where he finds a girl he likes, and he tells his parents that he wants to marry her. Keep in mind that back in the time of Judges, they didn't have the free thinking of today's society, where today it doesn't much matter who you marry, so long as you love them. The Israelites had strict laws about intermarrying with pagans because of gods that they worshipped and the probability that the Philistines would influence the Israelites towards their gods and away from the Lord. Yet this is what Samson wants, and this is where his trouble starts. When Samson and his parents go to ask for the girl's hands, Samson wanders off into some vineyards. Now, what would a man who's not supposed to have anything to do with grapes be doing in a vineyard? Well, he's out there wandering around, and a lion comes upon him. And in his first show of strength, Samson rips the lion apart and leaves it there. Later, when the family returns to the Philistine town to have the wedding ceremony, Samson finds the lion's carcass has become a beehive full of honey. He takes some of the honey and eats it, and then gives some to his parents. He simply neglects to tell them where it came from. Now remember, dead stuff is bad. So, in the second chapter of the life of Samson, he has already broken 2 of his lifelong vows. And he has disgraced his parents by marrying a Philistine. Some beginning for the judge of Israel. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know that I can fault Samson for some of his actions. As I said before, I like grapes. And if my parents had chosen the person I was going to marry, who's to say that I would have been as happy as I am in my marriage today? To have all of those restrictions placed upon you before you're even old enough to understand them, that's a lot to live up to. I could see rebellion as part of his teen years. How many of us, as parents, have given our children boundaries only to watch them push at those limits, testing us to see how far they can stretch the envelope before it breaks? And we're only telling them not to cross the street without holding our hand. Perhaps Samson was simply testing the limits of the envelope. Or maybe he was just showing his selfish streak at an early age. The middle of Samson's story is more of the same. He makes a bet with his new wife's people. They coerce his wife into giving him the answer to the riddle he asked them, and in order to pay off his debt, he uses the strength the Lord gave him to kill 30 men. Later, he killed 1,000 Philistine men with the jawbone of a donkey, and yet, when he talked about it, he claimed it was his accomplishment, not God's. And he continued to get into trouble time and time again. Does it sound familiar in some personal way? But finally, he became judge of Israel, where he ruled for 20 years. During that time, he had no qualms about sleeping with a prostitute or falling in love yet again with a Philistine woman named Delilah. Now it would appear that Samson was totally stricken by this woman who, by the way, doesn't seem to have felt the same way. You can tell because he just doesn't seem to see all the obvious things she does in her attempts to claim the bounty that the Philistine kings had placed on Samson's head. 3 times she asks him for the secret of his strength, and 3 times he lies to her about it. Each time he's pounced upon by the Philistines but escapes. After these first attempts, you'd think he'd get a clue. But after she asks a 4th time and nags him a bit, Samson finally gives her the true secret. Now, I've always thought that Samson is really dense through all of this. However, as I read the story this time, instead of feeling that Samson is just a fool for continuing to love Delilah, in spite of her repeated efforts to subdue him, I found myself wondering if this wasn't God's way of using the situation to teach Samson, and by extension us, a lesson. We learn in the book of Job that God won't bring about evil in hopes of producing good, but he can use evil that has happened to bring about good. It's kind of like what happened to us in this accident that we were just in. God didn't cause it to happen, but he allowed it to show his glory in ways that we don't even know yet. Samson was guilty of a lifetime of selfishness. Sometimes I wonder about my own life and how much of it has been spent on chasing after my own selfish desires rather than what God desires for me. Have I given in to that needs to fill my own cup because it'd be faster than waiting for what God has planned? The dollar menu, if you will, not the feast. So we have Samson as an example to show us what happens when we live a life constantly for ourselves. In the end, our cup, like his, gets emptied for us. The last chapter in Samson's life, Samson's hair is shorn, his strength is gone, he's captured, blinded, and pressed into service grinding grain for the Philistines, which is an act of worship toward their god, Dagon. His final act is to plead to the Lord and ask for strength to push out the pillars of the temple so that the roof would fall and kill the Philistines that were there to watch him. In this act, he cries out in his brokenness, and God hears him. While his life was not what God had planned, God still loved him and honored his heartfelt prayer. Samson finally does fulfill what the Lord had set him apart for before his life began, beginning the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Because of this, we hear about Samson in Hebrews 11:32. Not because of how great a job he did at living his life, but because of his willingness, in the end, to be used by God, even at the cost of his own life. Now, Samson was an example of someone whose cup had been emptied for him because of the selfish way he lived his life. Now, what about someone who lived their life for God most of the time? Someone like David. David wasn't set apart before his birth like Samson, but he was chosen by God to be the king of Israel. This same David who struck down Goliath with a single stone. After that tremendous victory and the anointing by Samuel, it should have been easy for David to follow God's direction for his life, right? If I had been chosen by the Lord to be a great ruler, I would like to think that I would serve God with all my heart, mind, soul, and strength. Unfortunately, that is not the case with David. Whether it was a matter of believing all the great stories that were told about him or just thinking that maybe he knew more of what he needed than God did, David found himself in a downward spiral away from God's plan. At the beginning of this story, we find David at home after sending his army off to war. It's a little odd, as kings at that time were expected and perhaps even required to lead their armies in battle. Had David done as expected and gone to war, he would not have ended up in the mess as he did. The decision to break with tradition and stay at home was the first of many questionable decisions that this wise king would make. So, David decides one evening to go for a stroll on the roof of the palace, and as he's walking, he looks down and he sees a beautiful woman. Here David finds himself faced with another decision. He could have simply turned away and left the rooftop and all would have been fine. No harm, no foul, so to speak. It could have just stopped right there. But David did not resist the temptation to delve deeper into the mire that he had already created for himself. Instead, he chooses to continue to satisfy his lustful curiosity, and he asks who this woman is. He's told that she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's very own men. Yet again, David has the opportunity to remove himself from the situation when he finds out that she's married. But he presses on. Don't you find yourself wanting to tell David to stop the madness before it consumes him? But he has reached a point on this slippery decline where he cannot turn back. He calls for the woman, sleeps with her, and lo and behold, she becomes pregnant. Now what should he do? Had David chosen to admit his sin, brought it out in the open, his brokenness may not have affected as many as it eventually did. However, David chooses the darker path. He attempts to hide what he had done. He calls for Bathsheba's husband to come home from the war, presumably to learn about the course the fighting is taking, but ultimately to try and lure Uriah, the husband, into sleeping with his wife so that the baby will be assumed to be Uriah's. It's unfortunate for both these men that Uriah is dedicated to serving his king. He may also have had an inkling of what had been going on while he was away. Despite numerous attempts by David to get Uriah to go home to be with his wife, including getting him drunk, Uriah will have nothing to do with the comforts of home while his fellow soldiers are sleeping in the field. David is again struck and he makes another bad decision. What is this? 4 at this point? At any rate, at this point, all he seems to be able to come up with is to have Uriah killed in battle. Then, with Uriah dead, David can marry Bathsheba and make his indiscretion legal. Not only does David decide to do this inconceivable act, but he sends Uriah back to the front lines with his own death sentence in his pocket. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. This is David we're discussing here, right? Not Saul, not Samson, not one of the many kings that ruled Israel, but did evil in the eyes of the Lord. This is David, chosen by God, a man after God's own heart. How does a faithful man like David come to fall so far? Did he wake up from his nap one afternoon and say, I think I'll go on the roof and see if there's a woman in my kingdom who I can take for my own, make pregnant, and then have her husband killed? No. David finds himself in this situation because he let bad decisions govern his thinking. You heard the analogy of the boiling frog? If you put a frog in a pot of boiling water, he leaps right out. He's no dummy. But if you put a frog in a pot of cool water and ever so slowly turn up the heat, change in temperature is very slow, and the frog ends up boiling to death. Each turn of the knob may be slightly uncomfortable, but only for a little while, and he gets used to it. And then that comfort is what kills him. Each decision David made might have been a little uncomfortable, but he felt he could handle it. Not to end the story here, but one of the things we can learn from David is that it doesn't matter how spiritual we think we are, or how close to God we think we are only one small step away from falling, just like David. If this man after God's own heart can fail, how much more so are we prone to making that same descent? So back to our story. Are we seeing David broken yet? Has he realized how far his transgression has taken him, where trying to fill his own cup has gotten him? Unfortunately, no. Uriah is killed in battle, as were many other brave soldiers. Bathsheba mourns, and then David takes her as his wife and moves her into his house. It's at this point of the story that we read in 2 Samuel 11:27, but the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Now, David may have thought he was in the clear. Uriah is gone, Bathsheba's his wife, and everything seems right with the world. But God knows what David has done. And he doesn't like it one bit. Enter Nathan the prophet, friend and advisor to David. Nathan tells David a story about a poor farmer, a rich man, and a little ewe lamb. This poor farmer had a lamb that is treated like a member of his family. Those of you who have pets know what I mean. When a visitor comes to the rich man, who, by the way, has more sheep than he can count, he prepares a meal for the visitor. But instead of taking one of his own many sheep, the pet lamb is taken from the farmer. Now David hears this story and he is outraged. He says the person who did this deserves to die and must pay for the lamb 4 times over. It's according to the law. At which point Nathan states that which David has refused to consider. You are the man. Can you hear it? David's cup turned upside down and everything draining out of it. David's cup has been emptied. Not for him, but through his actions. David's response is different than Samson's. While Samson pleaded with God so that he could die and fulfill his destiny, not wanting to live in his broken state, David admits his sin and mourns his brokenness. He realizes that his sin was not against Bathsheba, Uriah, or even his kingdom, but against the Lord himself. David takes full responsibility. The Lord used David's brokenness to work on his heart. Is there a time in your life that you cried out to God in your brokenness? God can use that and break down the walls of pride in your life so you will turn to him. And here we see God doing the same thing to David. At the end of the story, as punishment for his actions, David loses the son that Bathsheba bore him. But others lost as well. Bathsheba also lost that baby. And her previous husband, Uriah, lost his life. And there were other innocent soldiers that died too. His brokenness had consequences that were far more outreaching than himself. If our brokenness is caused by sin, there will be a price to others. We may not realize how great that cost can be to us or to others. David lost a lot, but through his time he gained an even greater trust in the Lord, and that did not let him go. Even though the storm of deceit that plagued David's life at this time, two of the Psalms that David wrote described what he was going through during this phase. Psalm 51 and Psalm 52. Psalm 51 and Psalm 32. Here's an excerpt from Psalm 32. Blessed is he whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord does not count against him, and in whose spirit is no deceit. When I keep silent, my bones wasted away. Through my groaning all day long, for day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. Then I acknowledged my sin to you, and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. David might have thought he got off scot-free before Nathan confronted him. But this psalm shows that God was still pursuing him while he insisted on trying to hide his sin. God pursues us in our sin and in our brokenness. God can use our suffering and brokenness to help us become stronger servants. When we come before the Lord broken but repentant, he's able to use us in our condition to help others also travel the broken road. You pray with me? Heavenly Father, Lord, each and every one of us is broken. Each and every one of us has something in common with David and with Samson. And Father, I just ask that you help us understand that while we know that we're broken, and while you know that we're broken, we must admit that to you. And Father, we need to come before you and say, Lord, I'm broken. And we know, because you told us so, that you will be there for us. So Lord, I just ask that everyone here today, at some point, admit their brokenness and lay it before you. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.